Hello everyone. Before we get started, don't forget to hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and drop a comment letting me know where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. That way, YouTube knows to keep sharing more stories like this with you. Now, let's jump in. Every Saturday morning right around 6, my neighbor Dale would fire up his lawnmower. It was like clockwork. You could set your watch to it. The sound would roll through the neighborhood like a heavy hum under the quiet air. I used to complain about it in my head, especially on those rare mornings I tried to sleep in. But after a while, it became part of the background of living there. Predictable, harmless, a kind of pattern that told you things were normal. Dale was one of those neighbors who kept everything neat. His grass was always trimmed to the exact same height. His tools were lined up perfectly along the back wall of his shed. The man had a routine and he didn't stray from it. He'd start at the same corner of his yard every Saturday, move in tight, overlapping rows, and finish with a blower that he ran along the sidewalk until every blade of cut grass was gone. You could tell he took pride in it. That's why it felt strange when one weekend in early September, I woke up to the sound of his mower at 3 in the morning. It was so dark outside that for a second I thought I was dreaming. But when I sat up and looked out my window, I saw the faint, shaky beam of a headlamp drifting across his yard. The mower was moving slow, steady, and in wide circles. The engine didn't sound strained like it did when it cut grass. It was smooth, constant, almost idle. I could see the faint cloud of exhaust in the light beam, a pulsing haze drifting through the cool air. I stood there for a while, half expecting him to stop, maybe realizing how early it was. But he just kept pacing in those circles, never breaking stride. I watched until the headlamp light swung toward my side of the fence, and I quietly stepped back into the dark. The sound went on for about another half hour before it stopped. The next morning, his yard looked the same as always. No grass cut, no tracks, nothing out of place. I thought maybe he couldn't sleep and decided to tinker. But when it happened again the next night, I started to get unsettled. That second night it was closer to 2 in the morning. Same low hum of the mower, same slow circles. The light of his headlamp gliding like a pendulum across the dark yard. I could see the faint glow bouncing off the side of his shed. The same one where he kept his fuel cans and tools. This time I stayed at the window longer. I realized that even though the mower was moving, the grass under it wasn't being cut. The blades weren't spinning. He was just walking, pushing the machine in circles. It kept happening. Not just once or twice, but almost every night that week. Always at random hours. Always the same pattern. The mower circling slowly, sometimes with the headlamp bobbing on and off, like he was switching it for some reason. It became this eerie routine that made me feel like something in the neighborhood had slipped slightly out of place, like reality had missed a step. Then came the morning when I noticed something new. The mower was still idling in his yard around 7. The sound was softer, like it had been running a long time, almost ready to sputter out. I waited for him to come out and shut it off, but he didn't. After another half hour, I decided to go over. The grass was wet with dew and the air smelled faintly of fuel. The mower was sitting in the middle of the yard, the engine humming quietly, exhaust rising in a light ribbon. The headlamp lay a few feet away in the grass, still glowing weakly. I didn't see Dale anywhere. I hesitated for a minute, then grabbed the handle and flipped the switch off. The silence that followed felt heavy. When I turned to go back, I noticed the shed door was slightly open. Not much, just a few inches. Enough to see the edge of a red gas can, and some tools hanging in their usual neat order. I figured maybe he'd gone inside and hadn't come out yet, so I let it go. That evening, though, I realized I hadn't seen him at all during the day. Usually he'd wave when I was out front, or he'd be working on something in his driveway. But his truck hadn't moved, his blinds were closed, and the mower was gone from where I'd left it. 2 nights later, I woke up to the same sound again. The mower. The low, even hum drifting through the dark. I looked out my window and saw the faint beam sweeping across his yard again, moving in those slow circles. The hair on my arms stood up. I had turned that mower off myself. I didn't go outside this time. I just stood and watched until the light faded, until the sound died off sometime before dawn. The next morning I called the police. When they arrived, they checked the house and the shed. I stood by the fence while they moved around his property, their voices low. After a while, one of them came over and told me they'd found him in the shed. He'd apparently collapsed sometime Thursday night, probably a heart attack. He'd been dead for days. I remember just staring at the officer because that didn't make sense. Thursday night was when I'd first seen him mowing in the dark. I didn't argue. They taped the area, started their work, and eventually hauled away the mower and some other things. For a while after that, I tried not to think about it, but a few details stuck with me. The mower had been moved between nights. Its fuel lines had been refilled. The choke had been adjusted each time it ran. Whoever or whatever was doing it knew how to handle that machine carefully, like someone who'd been doing it for years. After they took his body away, the shed was locked up by whoever handled his estate. The yard grew wild for a while, the grass long and uneven without him around to tend it. Then, about a week later, I woke to that familiar sound again, the low, steady hum of a mower. I shot out of bed and looked through the blinds. The sound was coming from Dale's yard again, but this time there was no light, no headlamp beam moving across the grass, just darkness, and that steady, mechanical noise filling the air. I stared until my eyes adjusted, until I could just make out the faint shadow of the mower sitting dead center in the yard. It wasn't moving, just running. The sound was constant and hollow, echoing off the empty houses down the street. Eventually I walked over, slowly, flashlight in hand. The grass was damp, the air cold. I stopped at the fence, watching the small engine shake gently as it ran. The shed door was closed, padlocked now. I waited, hoping maybe someone had been in there earlier and forgotten to shut the mower off. But there was no one. When I finally stepped into the yard, I saw something that made me stop. The grass around the mower was worn into faint circular paths, the same pattern Dale always mowed in. Not fresh tracks, but pressed down enough to show it had been moving there, over and over. I turned off the engine again, the silence swallowing the sound instantly. It never started again after that. A few weeks later, new people moved in. They tore down the shed and reseeded the lawn. Sometimes still wake up early, and out of habit I listen for that hum. There's nothing now, just the ordinary quiet of a street without its old routines. But even now, when the air is still and I'm up before dawn, I can almost hear it. That faint vibration, that rhythmic hum, just far enough away to make you think you imagined it. And I can't help but wonder who kept it running all those nights, or why. It was February 2022, one of those dull, gray weeks in Dayton, Ohio, when everything felt cold and tired. I lived alone in a small two-story duplex on the west side of town. The upper unit was rented by an older woman named Mrs. Ransom. I didn't know much about her, just that she kept to herself, always dressed neatly, and drove an old beige Buick that hadn't moved much through the winter. She was polite but distant, the type who'd give a little wave in the parking lot but never stop for conversation. That was fine by me. I liked the quiet. My unit was the lower half of the duplex, and hers was directly above mine. The floors weren't thick, so I could hear her walking sometimes, usually just the soft padding of slippers or the creak of a chair when she sat down. She had a habit of watching TV late into the night, though never loud enough to be annoying. Just a faint murmur of voices from above that I'd grown used to. I'd sometimes fall asleep to that low hum, like background noise from another world. It was a Thursday night when I first noticed something off. I woke up around 2 a.m., not sure why at first. It wasn't any loud sound, but something rhythmic. Footsteps. Heavy ones. Slow. They moved across the ceiling from one end of her apartment to the other, paused, then came back again. The pattern repeated, the sound uneven and dragging as if she was shuffling more than walking. I stared up at the ceiling in the dark, waiting for it to stop, but it went on. I remember thinking maybe she couldn't sleep. Maybe her leg hurt, or she was pacing while on the phone. After an hour or so, the sound changed. One loud, dull thud that made the ceiling shake slightly. Then nothing. Complete silence. I lay there listening for another few minutes, but there was no more movement. Eventually, I convinced myself it was nothing serious and went back to sleep. When I woke up the next morning, I forgot about it. I made coffee, got ready for work, and when I stepped outside, her car was still parked in its usual spot. Nothing seemed out of place. That evening when I came home, I noticed something strange. Her TV was on. I could hear it faintly through the ceiling. The same channel I'd heard before, the news, with the steady tone of a reporter's voice. I didn't think much of it at first. Maybe she was just resting, or had fallen asleep watching it. But later, when I was getting ready for bed, I realized the sound hadn't changed. No shifting voices, no commercials, no movement upstairs. Just the same low, unchanging hum. It was odd, but I tried not to overthink it. Maybe she left it on overnight. The next morning, it was still playing. Same volume, same rhythm of voices. By the third day, it started to bother me. It wasn't just the sound. It was the lack of any other sign of life. Normally, even if she was quiet, there'd be a few creaks during the day or the sound of her walking to the kitchen or water running. But there was nothing. Just that low, constant voice from her TV above my ceiling. Every night, I'd sit on my couch staring upward, wondering if she was okay. Wondering if I should knock on her door. But it felt intrusive. Maybe she was sick. Maybe she'd gone somewhere and left it on. I kept coming up with reasons not to get involved. By the fourth day, I started feeling uneasy in my own home. The sound became heavier somehow, like it was pressing on me. I turned up my own TV to drown it out. But at night, when everything went quiet, I could still hear it faintly above me, just steady and unchanging. It was unnerving. Like someone whispering on repeat through the floor. That Monday morning, I finally called the landlord. I told him something was wrong, that I hadn't seen Mrs. Ransom in days and her TV had been on nonstop. He said he'd swing by that afternoon. When I came home from work, his truck was parked out front. The front door of the upstairs unit was open, and he was standing in the doorway with a hand over his mouth. I walked up the steps and he stopped me before I reached the top. He said quietly, "You don't want to come in here." I didn't listen. I looked past him. The apartment was dim, blinds closed, the air stale and thick. Mrs. Ransom was lying on the living room floor, half covered by a blanket. She'd been dead for at least a week. The coroner later said it was probably a stroke. The weirdest part was that her TV was off, completely off. The power light wasn't even on, but that wasn't the worst of it. Sitting on the end table beside her couch was an old landline phone, the kind with a little built-in answering machine and a speaker. The landlord had unplugged it when he walked in, but he told me it had been playing something on a loop the entire time. He plugged it back in to show me. The speaker crackled and then a voice came through. "Mom? You there?" It was a man's voice, her son probably. Then a brief silence, then the same message again. "Mom, you there?" It was repeating automatically, the old machine stuck in playback mode, replaying the saved message again and again. That's when everything fell into place. The sound I'd thought was her TV all those nights wasn't the TV at all. It had been that recording, echoing endlessly from the room above me. That steady, low murmur I'd heard through my ceiling was her son's voice calling to a woman who'd already died days earlier. I'd sat beneath it for 4 nights, convincing myself she was alive because I didn't want to believe otherwise. The police and coroner were in and out for hours. I stayed downstairs, sitting on my couch with the lights off, staring at the ceiling that now felt thinner than ever. I could still hear the faint echo of that voice in my head. "Mom, you there?" repeating over and over, blending with the sound of the wind outside. I didn't sleep that night or the one after. Even when everything was quiet again, my mind kept replaying that dragging sound from the night she died. The slow footsteps that went back and forth for hours before that final thud made me wonder if she'd tried to get help, tried to make it to the phone before collapsing. Maybe that was what I'd heard. A few weeks later, the landlord rented the upstairs unit again. A young couple moved in, friendly, cheerful, always playing music. I smiled and waved when I saw them. but I never told them about Mrs. Ransom. Some nights when I lay in bed, I still catch myself listening for sounds from above. Even if it's just the creak of a floorboard, it makes my heart race for a second. Because no matter how much time passes, I'll always remember those 4 nights, lying there in the dark, listening to a dead woman's phone repeating her son's voice through the ceiling, and doing nothing because I thought it was just the TV. I moved into that small neighborhood in Charlottesville in early 2016, just trying to get a quieter place after years of apartment living. The street was calm, lined with oaks and modest one-story homes, the kind where mailboxes leaned a little and people waved when they drove by. Across the road from me sat an old white 2-story house that looked like it had been forgotten by time. The paint was flaking, the shutters hung crooked, and the lawn had grown wild enough that the grass brushed the bottom of the porch steps. I never saw anyone go in or out. The mailbox was gone, the driveway cracked with weeds, and the front door was chained from the inside. From what I heard, the last owners had left during the housing crash and never came back. For months, it was just part of the scenery, a dead house across a quiet street. But around mid-April, I started noticing something odd. Every night around midnight, a light came on in the upstairs window on the right. Not flickering, not dim, just a steady, pale yellow light that stayed on for maybe 20 minutes before going dark again. At first, I figured it was a timer or some old wiring glitch, but it happened too regularly, always at midnight. Same room, same light. One night, curiosity got the better of me. I walked across the street up to the front porch. The boards groaned under my feet. I looked through the front window, just darkness and the faint smell of rot coming through the gaps in the wood. The place looked sealed. I pulled gently on the front door. Didn't budge. Jane, just like before. I could see the padlock through the crack. I walked around the side and tried to look in, but every window was covered in dust and grime. When I got back home, the light was off. I tried to brush it off as nothing. Maybe just old wiring or someone setting up a motion sensor inside for some reason. But the next few nights it happened again, midnight sharp. The same glow in that same upstairs window. After about a week, I finally called the non-emergency police line. They sent a patrol car out. I watched from my porch as 2 officers parked, walked up, and circled the property with flashlights. They shined the beams into windows, tried the doors, even checked the backyard. I could see their silhouettes moving around in the dark, their radios crackling faintly. After about 10 minutes, one of them waved at me and said it was clear. Locked up, no sign of anyone inside. But the next night, at exactly midnight, the light came on again. It started to bother me more than I expected. I'd sit at my window, watching the empty house across the street, feeling that strange tension build up every time the clock crept toward 12. I tried to ignore it, but every night it felt like the light was waiting to appear. Finally, I brought out an old pair of binoculars I had from my hiking days. That night, the air was cool and still. The street was quiet, no cars, no crickets even. I turned off the lights in my own living room so the reflection wouldn't block my view. At 11:58, I was sitting there, elbows on the windowsill, eyes fixed on that upper right window. At exactly midnight, the bulb flared to life. The soft yellow glow filled the small square of glass, and for a moment I felt something tighten in my chest. I lifted the binoculars and focused. The window was dusty, but I could see someone standing there. They were right at the window, close enough that the light hit their face and shoulders. From where I sat, it looked like a man, tall and thin, just standing still, facing straight toward me. No movement, no shifting of weight, just standing staring. I froze. My arms started trembling slightly, the binoculars shaking in my hands. I adjusted the focus and stared for several minutes, waiting for him to move, to blink, to do something. But he didn't. The figure didn't even sway. I could make out the outline of the head, the shadow of shoulders, but there was no detail, no expression, no color, nothing distinct. Just the shape of a person lit from behind by that faint yellow glow. I sat there for nearly half an hour, watching, barely breathing. Then the light went off. For a few minutes, I just sat staring at the dark window. My skin felt cold, my palms slick with sweat. I kept telling myself it had to be some weird reflection. Maybe something inside casting a shadow, or even someone pulling a prank. But deep down, I knew what I saw. The next morning, I couldn't stop thinking about it. I decided to go over there in daylight just to put my mind at ease. I crossed the street and stepped through the tall grass that reached my knees. The air smelled like mildew and earth. I went around the side and found a window with the latch rusted open. I slid it up and climbed inside. The air was thick and stale. Dust covered everything. There were footprints in the dust, my own now freshly pressed, but nothing else. No sign of squatters, no trash, no sleeping bag or food wrappers. The downstairs rooms were empty, stripped down to bare floors and cracked walls. I went upstairs carefully, each step creaking beneath my weight. The room that matched the glowing window was at the end of the hall. The door was open halfway. Inside, morning light filtered through the window, illuminating an empty space. The floorboards were bare, the walls stained. A single dead moth lying near the baseboard. I looked up at the ceiling, no wiring, no fixtures. Just an old bulb socket with a bulb lying on the floor beneath it. Unscrewed. A thin layer of dust covering the glass. I picked it up. Cold. It hadn't been used in a long time. I turned it over in my hand, looking at the faint blackened filament inside, wondering how it could have produced light at all. I checked the outlet below the window, no power. The copper wires had been cut and left exposed. There was no way any electricity had been running to that room. When I left, I double-checked the front door. Still chained, still locked from the inside. I crossed back to my house, feeling the kind of unease that doesn't fade quickly. That night I stayed up past midnight just watching. The light never came on again. I've lived here for years now, and that house is still empty. The grass still grows wild. The shutters still hang loose. I've asked around, and no one's ever seen anyone there, not once. But sometimes late at night when I pass by the upstairs window, I feel that same stillness, like something on the other side of the glass is waiting quietly in the dark. And even though it's been years, I've never been able to convince myself that what I saw that night wasn't real. Because the one detail I keep going back to, the thing I can't explain no matter how I try. When I was looking through those binoculars, the person in that window wasn't lit from behind. The light was shining on them from the front, like they were standing in the dark facing my house, illuminated by something I couldn't see. It was early winter in Scranton, Pennsylvania, December 2018. Nights were long, cold, and dead quiet in my neighborhood. I lived in a small house on the edge of a cul-de-sac, the kind of place where the snow piled up along the curbs and the only sounds at night came from the distant hum of the interstate or the occasional plow scraping by. My next-door neighbor, Mrs. Keller, was an older woman in her late 70s. She lived alone, always kept to herself. Her house was nearly identical to mine. Same layout, same small back porch, but hers always looked darker somehow. Like the lights never fully reached the corners of the rooms. I used to see her outside in the mornings, bundled in a faded green coat, feeding the stray cats that roamed around our yards. She'd line up small tins of food along the porch railing, whispering to them softly. Even in the middle of winter, she never missed a morning. She moved slowly, her hands shaking as she poured food, but she always smiled if she caught me watching. That was the extent of our interaction. Just a polite wave or nod. I didn't know much about her except that she'd lived there for decades and that her husband had died years ago. The rest of her family, if she had any, never visited. It started about 2 weeks before Christmas. I was sitting in my living room, half asleep on the couch, when I heard 3 slow knocks on my back door. Not loud, just enough to make me look up. I froze for a second, listening. The knocks came again after a few seconds, 3 of them, spaced out, steady. I checked the clock on my phone. 12:07 a.m. At first, I thought maybe it was one of the neighborhood kids playing some dumb prank. There weren't many of them around. but a few teenagers cut through the yard sometimes. I didn't bother checking. It was cold, snowing lightly, and I didn't feel like dealing with anyone at that hour. I turned the TV volume up a bit and waited, but the knocks didn't come again. A few nights later, it happened again. 3 knocks. Exactly the same, slow, deliberate, almost careful. This time I got up, walked to the back door, and looked out through the blinds. Nothing. The porch light was on, casting that dull yellow glow across the snow. But no footprints, no shadows, nothing moving. The air outside looked still, frozen. I started paying more attention after that. It didn't happen every night, just once every few days. Always around midnight. Always 3 knocks. It was too specific to be random, too spaced out to be wind or a tree branch. I even checked around outside the next morning and found faint impressions in the snow near the porch, like small boot prints, but they were half filled by new snow and didn't go far. I assumed they belonged to a delivery driver or someone who'd cut through the yard earlier that day. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone had been standing just outside my door, waiting quietly in the dark. One night near the end of the month, I was in the kitchen making tea when I heard it again. 3 knocks. I didn't move this time. I just stood there with the mug in my hand, staring at the back door. The sound was softer than before, almost gentle. I switched off the kitchen light and slowly pulled the corner of the blinds open. Outside, the snow was fresh from that evening, untouched except for a narrow line of footprints leading away from my porch, straight toward Mrs. Keller's back gate. I only saw the person for a second, maybe less. Someone bundled up in a coat, walking slowly, head down, disappearing behind her house. The shape looked too small to be a man. My first thought was that it was her, but that didn't make sense. It was almost 1 in the morning, and she hardly ever went out at night, especially not in the snow. I watched until the figure was gone, then let the blinds fall shut. The next morning, I decided to go check on her. I told myself it was just neighborly concern, but honestly, I think I wanted to confirm that I hadn't imagined what I saw. When I stepped outside, I saw a police car parked in front of her house. 2 officers were standing near the porch talking quietly. One of them looked up when he noticed me and told me to stay back. The front door was open, and through the gap I could see a paramedic's bag on the floor inside. One of the officers told me she'd passed away in her sleep 3 nights ago. That detail sat in my head like a weight I couldn't shake off. 3 nights ago, I stood there in the cold for a while, staring at her house, the snow crunching softly under my boots. The cat dishes were still lined up on her porch rail, all frozen solid. No one had touched them. Her curtains were drawn, same as always, and there were no footprints around her yard. None except the ones I'd seen leading there the night before. I went back inside, trying to reason it out. Maybe a family member had come by, though I'd never seen any. Maybe someone else had been feeding the cats for her. But if she'd been gone 3 nights, that meant every one of those knocks came after she'd already died. That didn't sit right with me, but I forced myself not to think about it. I didn't believe in anything supernatural. There had to be some explanation I wasn't seeing. Later that week, after they'd taken her body and locked up the house, I noticed something strange. The snow along the fence line between our yards had a narrow path worn through it. Small prints, like someone had been walking back and forth between our porches. I followed them, half expecting they'd stop somewhere, but they didn't. They looped from her back steps straight to mine and back again, over and over, maybe a dozen times. The pattern was uneven, the spacing short, like whoever made them had been moving slowly, shuffling. That night, I pushed a heavy chair against my back door before going to bed. I didn't hear any knocks again, but I kept waking up every hour, staring toward the window. The silence felt heavier than usual, like something was missing from it. The next morning, I went out again just to check. The snow had melted slightly, then refrozen overnight, sealing the prints in a thin crust of ice. They were still there, perfectly clear. Over the next few days, the police came and went, mostly dealing with the house. They said her relatives from out of state would handle her things, but no one showed up for a long time. Weeks passed, and her porch stayed the same. Cat dishes frozen in place, mailbox overflowing, light above the door still burned out. Eventually, I stopped looking over there. I stopped using the back door altogether. Even now, sometimes if the night is quiet enough, I find myself pausing before bed, listening for those 3 slow knocks, half expecting them to start again. I tell myself it was just coincidence. Maybe someone really was walking through the yards those nights. Maybe the timing lined up by chance. But sometimes when I think back to that cold December morning, to the way the footprints led back to her empty house, I can't help but wonder why they stopped after the police came, why the snow stayed untouched after that. Why? No matter how many winters have passed since, I still can't bring myself to look out that back window after midnight. I bought the house in late spring. It was an old ranch-style place, 1 story with faded green siding and a patchy lawn that needed more care than I had time for. The lot was narrow but long, stretching out to a sagging wooden fence that separated my property from my neighbor's. His name was Alan. He'd lived there for years, maybe decades. The first few weeks were fine. He waved when I moved in, even offered to lend me a mower. But everything changed the day I mentioned the fence. It started small. I was out back raking leaves when I noticed that the fence didn't line up with the property markers on the survey papers I got from the sale. It leaned a few inches past what the papers said was mine. I figured I'd bring it up politely. I mentioned it in passing one afternoon when he was tending his garden. He stiffened up immediately, said the fence had always been there and wasn't moving. I told him I had documentation, but he just shook his head. Said something about how people like me always tried to start trouble. I didn't say anything after that, but from that day on, things started to sour. A few days later, I found a note in my mailbox. It was written neatly on lined paper. "Let's settle this calmly," it said. "No reason to fight over a few inches of dirt." It seemed reasonable, but the tone felt passive-aggressive, like a warning more than a peace offering. I didn't reply. Figured it was better to just leave it alone for now. The next note wasn't so nice. It was typed this time. "Keep off my side. I'm watching." That one made my stomach twist. I hadn't even been near his property since our talk. Over the next few weeks, the notes kept coming. Some were polite, some weren't. One would say something like, "I hope we can come to an understanding," and another would accuse me of trespassing or spying. I never caught him leaving them, but I knew it was him. No one else would care that much. I tried to ignore it, but I started noticing other small things. My trash bin, which I kept by the side of the house, was knocked over twice in 1 week. My hose had been dragged across the yard and left coiled on the wrong side of the fence. I didn't have proof, but I knew who was doing it. Then one day, the notes stopped. No paper in the mailbox, no weird signs, nothing. A week passed, then 2. Started to relax, thinking maybe he'd moved on or realized how ridiculous the whole thing was. I even started to feel bad, wondering if I'd overreacted or misread the situation. That feeling didn't last long. One night late in August, I woke up to a steady, rhythmic sound. A dull thud, like someone hammering something. It took me a few seconds to orient myself. I checked the clock just past midnight. The sound came again. Thud, thud. Then the faint squeal of nails scraping wood. I sat up, trying to figure out where it was coming from. It wasn't distant. It was close. Too close. I got out of bed and stood by the window. The sound wasn't coming from his yard. It was right up against my bedroom wall. I couldn't see much in the dark, just the faint outline of the fence in the moonlight. The hammering went on for another few minutes, then stopped abruptly. Silence. No footsteps, no voices. Just still air and the faint buzz of crickets. I barely slept after that. When I went out in the morning, the air still had that early fall chill. Dew clung to the grass, and the wood of the fence looked darker than usual. At first, I didn't notice anything different. Then halfway down the fence line, I saw it. A fresh board, lighter than the rest, newly nailed in place. In the center of it, my name had been burned in. The letters uneven, but clearly deliberate. The wood was blackened around the edges where it had been scorched. It looked like someone had used a torch to do it. My stomach dropped. I stared at it for a long time. My first thought was to confront him, but something stopped me. I took a photo instead, just in case. Later that day, when I saw him by his driveway, I mentioned it. He acted surprised, said he hadn't seen it and blamed kids in the neighborhood. I didn't believe him. He had this faint smirk when he said it, like he enjoyed watching me try to figure it out. I didn't argue. I just nodded and went back inside. After that, I started keeping my curtains closed at night. I stopped going into the backyard after dark. Every time I heard a noise outside, I'd freeze. For weeks, nothing else happened, but the tension never went away. Then, about a month later, everything changed. It was a Thursday morning, early September. I was getting ready for work when I heard sirens. At first, I thought it was just an ambulance passing through, but they didn't fade. They got louder, stopping right near my house. I went outside and saw thick smoke rising from behind the row of houses. It took me a second to realize it was his place. Flames were climbing up from the back of his garage, black smoke pouring into the sky. Fire trucks were already pulling in, neighbors standing out in their yards watching. The air smelled like burning chemicals and melted plastic. The fire spread fast, but the firefighters got it under control before it reached the main house. Alan wasn't home. He was at work, someone said. When they finished, part of his garage was gone, and the rest of it looked like a blackened shell. The next day, I saw the fire inspector walking around with a clipboard, talking to one of the firemen. I overheard bits of what they were saying. Something about it starting near the tool bench, maybe from a torch that had been left plugged in or malfunctioned. I remembered the same kind of torch in his hands a few weeks earlier, when he was burning something in his driveway. I'd watched him from my window that day, the flame hissing blue in the air. He came back that evening, stood staring at the ruins of his garage for a long time. I watched from my kitchen window, not out of curiosity, but because I couldn't look away. For the first time since the fence argument, he looked small. I never said anything about it, never mentioned the burned board or the torch. The next day, I took the board off my side of the fence and threw it in the trash. I didn't even tell the police about it when they came around asking questions. I figured it was over in a way it was. He never replaced the part of the fence that burned. He started keeping to himself, barely looked at me when we crossed paths. The yard between us grew over with weeds, and the line between our properties blurred again. But every now and then when I'm out back at night, I still look toward where that board used to hang. I can almost see the faint outline of my name burned into the wood, like a warning or a reminder. Some things don't fade no matter how much time passes. I moved into my house in Lubbock, Texas in the spring of 2023. The neighborhood was quiet, mostly families and older couples who'd lived there for decades. My place sat near the end of a cul-de-sac, backed by a row of open fields that stretched out toward the highway. You could stand in my backyard at night and see nothing but flat land, blinking radio towers, and the orange haze from the city lights far off in the distance. It was peaceful in a way that made you forget how empty it really was. Around early May, a young couple moved into the house next door. Their names were Mason and Claire. I only learned that from the moving truck paperwork one morning, not from talking to them. They were polite enough, though. Mason waved the day I was mowing my lawn, said something about just settling in. Claire smiled a few times when she passed by, usually early in the morning, walking to her car in scrubs. She must have worked at one of the hospitals. Mason said he worked in restoration. That was the word he used, kind of vague but believable. Maybe furniture or cars. He had a tall, thin build and those kinds of hands that looked used to tools. The first couple of weeks they were quiet. Their yard was tidy, garage closed, lights off at a decent hour. But little by little, I started to notice small things that didn't fit. Around the middle of May, I'd see the light under their garage door still glowing at 2 or 3 a.m. It wasn't bright, just that dull yellow fluorescent type that hums faintly. Sometimes there was a soft buzzing sound that came with it, something electrical, maybe a tool or compressor. I'd hear it even through my closed windows. It wasn't constant. It would start and stop like someone flicking a switch on and off. At first I figured he did woodworking or metal refinishing. The smell was what threw me off. On still nights, I'd step outside and catch strong chemical odors, like paint thinner or formaldehyde, coming from his side of the fence. Burned your nose a little, the kind of smell that clung to your clothes even after you went back inside. A week later, I noticed he'd covered every window in the house with thick black plastic. Not curtains, not blinds, actual plastic sheets taped around the edges. It looked strange even from the street. At night, the house was pitch black, no lights visible through any window, not even from the kitchen or hallway. Just dark. The garage door stayed closed all the time now, except when he drove out in the mornings. I rarely saw Claire anymore. Her car would come and go, sometimes not at all for a couple of days. It bothered me, but not enough to do anything about it. You learn to mind your business in small neighborhoods. People get weird about privacy, and besides, I didn't want to be the nosy neighbor who called the cops over smells and late-night noises. Still, I couldn't help but notice the change. Even the mail carrier stopped dropping things directly at their box, instead leaving them stacked awkwardly on top, like she didn't want to linger there. One night in late May around 3 a.m., I woke up to silence. The hum of my refrigerator and the ceiling fan had stopped. The whole house was dead quiet. I looked out the window and saw every porch light on the street was off. The power was out, some outage across the block. The night was darker than usual, the kind where your eyes can't adjust fast enough. Then I saw it, the faintest orange glow leaking from the edges of Mason's garage door. Wasn't bright, just enough to see the shimmer of light rippling along the bottom. A moment later, a thick, bitter smell drifted over, like burning plastic mixed with something rotten. It was so strong it made my throat tighten. I went out into my backyard and the air was hazy. That low orange glow pulsed, like something flickering inside. I stood there for maybe half a minute before realizing the smell was spreading fast, heavier, thicker. It had that chemical sting again, but worse. My eyes watered. A dull popping sound came from the garage, like small bubbles bursting. Then came a muffled whoosh, and the glow brightened into a deep orange, lighting up their entire driveway. The smell hit harder, burning plastic, maybe resin, mixed with something else I couldn't place. By the time I ran inside to call 911, other neighbors were coming out onto their porches, pointing toward the smoke. The fire department arrived fast, sirens bouncing off the quiet streets, red lights flashing across the rooftops. I stood by the curb as they forced open the garage door. I remember the heat washing over everyone, even from a distance. Inside, I caught glimpses between the firefighters. Metal shelves, scorched tables, melted containers. It was like some kind of lab, but not the kind I'd seen on TV. The smoke carried a sour stench that didn't fade even after the fire was out. Later, one of the firefighters walked out shaking his head. I overheard someone say they found dozens of jars, rows and rows of them, all labeled, filled with cloudy liquid, some cracked from the heat. The labels had words written in neat block letters, but the only one I saw clearly before they pushed everyone back read, Specimen 14. The next day, the house was cordoned off. Police cars sat outside for hours. Claire never came back. I didn't see her once after that night. Mason was taken away in the back of a squad car around noon. He looked calm, not panicked or angry. Just calm, staring straight ahead like he didn't care where they were taking him. A week passed before any official word came out. Local news said hazardous materials were found in a residential garage, but nothing about what they were. Rumors spread fast. Some said he was preserving animal organs for study. Others said body parts. Didn't want to believe that, but after what I'd seen, it didn't sound impossible. For days after, that smell lingered in the air, even after the fire crews left. It soaked into the ground somehow, like it didn't want to leave. I had to keep my windows closed just to sleep, but even with them shut, every time I turned off the lights at night, I could still picture that dim orange glow behind my eyelids. I'd think about those jars, the way the cloudy liquid had caught the firelight before they shattered. I started avoiding that side of the house. The fence between our yards felt like it wasn't enough. The thought that I'd spent weeks sleeping a few feet away from whatever he was doing made my skin crawl. I'd walk into my kitchen late at night and catch myself listening for that faint buzzing sound, half expecting it to start again, even though the house next door was empty. By June, the house was still sealed off. No one mowed the yard. No one touched the black plastic still stuck to the windows. Grass grew high along the driveway where the fire trucks had been parked. Just sat there, quiet and dead-looking. I tried to forget about it, but sometimes when the wind shifts in the evening, there's a faint chemical smell that drifts through my backyard. It's not strong, just enough to make me notice. Enough to remind me that behind that fence, in that sealed-up garage, there were shelves of jars, each one holding something that never should have been there in the first place. It took me weeks to start sleeping again. And even now, I wake up sometimes thinking I see that orange glow flicker through the trees, just for a second, before it disappears. My neighbor's backyard motion light had been acting strange for months before I ever really paid attention to it. It was one of those standard white floodlights mounted above his back door, the kind that clicks on with a small mechanical sound whenever something moves. I used to notice it from my kitchen window, especially late at night when I couldn't sleep. The light would flick on suddenly, casting that bright white glow over his yard, stay on for a minute or two, and then shut off again. At first I thought it was normal, maybe a stray cat cutting through the yards or wind setting off the sensor. Our house is backed up to a small strip of trees and tall grass. Nothing too thick, but enough to shelter raccoons and the occasional opossum. For a while it didn't bother me. But the pattern started to get odd. The light didn't just come on once or twice a night. Some nights it would click on, go off, then click on again, almost immediately, like something was pacing back and forth. I'd see it happen at 2, 3 in the morning. Always the same part of the yard too, near the back right corner, close to the trees. I told myself not to overthink it. Still, there was something about the timing that didn't sit right. It wasn't random. It was too deliberate, too spaced out. One night in early September, I was up late in the kitchen because I couldn't sleep. I'd made some tea and the house was completely quiet. The only light came from the microwave clock. I stood there staring out the window toward the neighbor's backyard. It was one of those cool nights when the air feels heavy and still. Then I saw the motion light snap on. It filled the yard with harsh white light, lighting up the grass and the fence line. For a second, nothing moved. Then it went off again. About 30 seconds later, it came on once more. At first, I thought maybe it was just a small animal triggering it, but something about the rhythm made me watch longer. The pattern repeated, on, off, on again. I realized after a few minutes that it wasn't random movement. It was something or someone moving just beyond the range of the light. The light only reached maybe 20 feet from the house, but I could see faint movement, a darker shadow shifting against the dim background beyond the glow. It circled the yard slowly, keeping to the darker area, never crossing into the beam. Each time it passed close to the corner, the light would sense it and turn on again. The more I stared, the clearer it became. It wasn't an animal. The movement was upright, tall, deliberate. It was a person walking slowly around his house just outside the light's reach. The air felt colder suddenly, and I remember realizing that I was standing in complete darkness myself, visible if anyone happened to glance toward my window. I quietly stepped back into the shadows and kept watching. The light flicked on and off 3 more times over the next 20 minutes. Whoever it was just kept circling, slow and steady, like they were waiting for something. I barely slept that night. The next morning I saw my neighbor when he was out front getting the paper. I told him I'd seen his light going off a lot lately, and mentioned maybe he should check the sensor. He shrugged and said he'd noticed footprints in the dew some mornings, but assumed they were mine from when I mowed near the property line. That part bothered me. I hadn't been near his yard in weeks. After that, I started paying close attention. Every night, between 2 and 3 in the morning, that light would go off at least once. Some nights I stayed up just to watch. I never saw the person directly, just movement. A faint shift of darkness near the far edge of the yard. Sometimes the light would come on and stay lit for several minutes, as if whoever it was had stopped moving. Other times it blinked rapidly, like they were pacing faster. A few nights later, I decided to try recording it. I set my phone in the window, pointed toward the backyard, and let it run for an hour. When I checked the footage the next morning, the light had turned on 4 separate times. Each time the same faint shadow appeared, tall, broad-shouldered, walking the perimeter. It never entered the beam fully. It stayed right on that edge where the light faded into darkness. The more I watched it, the more I felt like the person knew exactly where that limit was. A week after that, the pattern changed. One night the light turned on and stayed on. I noticed it around 2 a.m., still glowing steadily when I got up to get water. I figured maybe the sensor jammed or the switch had been left on. But when I looked out again at 3:30, it was still lit. That was unusual. I went to bed uneasy, telling myself it was nothing serious. The next morning, I woke to sirens. 2 police cars and an ambulance were parked on our street, lights flashing against the windows. When I stepped outside, the neighbor's back gate was open, and a small group of people stood near his porch. I caught bits and pieces of conversation as officers moved around. My neighbor had been found unconscious near his back door early that morning. Head wound, wallet missing. They said it looked like someone had hit him from behind, maybe during a robbery. The motion light apparently had been on all night. The police believed he might have stepped outside after noticing it and caught whoever had been lurking there. There were footprints, clear ones leading around the entire yard and up to the porch. The same looping pattern I'd seen night after night. They followed the prints through the wet grass, but they stopped abruptly near the back fence, where the ground turned to packed dirt. The person had come and gone the same way each time, just far enough to stay out of view. After that, I couldn't stop thinking about how long it had gone on. Weeks of circling, watching, testing how close they could get before someone noticed. My neighbor had probably stepped outside thinking it was nothing, maybe just an animal like he'd always assumed. The police never found the person who did it, and my neighbor eventually recovered, but he sold the house a few months later. Sometimes, even now, I'll glance out my kitchen window at night and imagine that faint shape pacing just beyond the light. I can still remember how deliberate the movements were, how calm they looked, as if the person knew exactly what they were doing, waiting for the night when someone would finally step outside to see for themselves. When the old lady next door passed away, it felt strange seeing her house so still. For years, that place had been full of noise. Her radio, the creak of her back door, the faint smell of her cooking drifting over the fence. After the ambulance came one morning and left without sirens, her curtains stayed drawn, and the mail began piling up in the box. I used to glance at it every day when I walked past. A part of me thought maybe she'd step out again in her old housecoat, scolding the neighborhood cats or calling to someone passing by. But she didn't. A few weeks later, her son showed up. I'd seen him only a few times before. Tall, thin, always with a kind of distant look, like his mind was somewhere else. He moved in quietly. Didn't bring much, just a few boxes and some tools. He said he was there to clean up the place. I didn't think much of it at first. Everyone handles grief differently. Some people dive into work. Some people go silent for a while. For the first few days, he barely came outside during daylight. Sometimes late at night, I'd see a dim light moving around in her basement windows. It was one of those narrow rectangles near the ground, the kind that only lets in a sliver of light. The glow would move back and forth for hours. At first, I assumed he was sorting through old things, maybe fixing something. But as nights went on, the light seemed to stay on longer and longer. Sometimes until dawn, then came the smell. It started faint, something sharp and sour. I noticed it one morning while doing laundry in my basement. The air felt thicker than usual, heavy with a metallic tang that caught in the throat. It wasn't sewage and it wasn't mold. It was something else. The smell seemed to drift through the vent near the ceiling that connected to the shared wall between our houses. Over the next few days, it got stronger. Every time the furnace kicked on, the smell came with it, like something burned or rotted deep inside the ducts. I tried cleaning the vents, changed the filters, even poured bleach down the drain thinking maybe it was plumbing. Nothing helped. One afternoon I saw him out front hauling a box from his truck. I mentioned the smell when we passed each other on the driveway. He looked up, smiled in this strange way, tight-lipped like he was forcing it, and said, "Just paint thinner." I nodded, pretending that made sense, but something about the way he said it didn't feel right. His eyes looked tired, sunken, but alert, like he hadn't slept in days. The smell lingered for another week, then suddenly stopped. I remember feeling relieved but uneasy at the same time, like whatever caused it hadn't gone away, just gone quiet. Around that same time, I started hearing noises at night. My bedroom faces the side of his house, and the sound came from his backyard. Dull thuds, something being dragged, sometimes the whine of metal scraping concrete. I tried to ignore it, told myself he was just doing late-night repairs or hauling old furniture. But then one night, I woke up around 3 in the morning to the sound of a truck engine. I looked out through the blinds and saw him in his driveway under the yellow streetlight, loading heavy black bags into the back of his pickup. He moved slowly, carefully, as if each one was fragile or heavy enough to need both arms. The way he bent his knees, the way his face strained, it wasn't trash. Or if it was, it wasn't normal trash. He kept looking around, not in a panicked way, but cautious, like someone who didn't want to be seen. He finished after about 20 minutes, got into the truck and drove off without turning his headlights on until he was halfway down the street. I didn't sleep that night. The next morning I checked the side of his house. There were fresh marks on the concrete near the basement steps, a few dark smears like something had been dragged. I told myself not to get involved. It wasn't my business. Maybe he was clearing junk. Maybe it was old furniture or yard waste. Still, the thought stuck in my head like a splinter. For the next week, his house was silent. No lights in the basement, no truck in the driveway. Then one morning, I noticed the mailbox overflowing again. Curtains drawn, the grass starting to grow long. It was like he'd never been there at all. Weeks turned into months, and I almost forgot about it. Life went on. Work, errands, little routines that fill the space between. Sometimes I'd glance at that house and wonder when it would sell, who would move in next. Then one afternoon there was a knock on my door. I opened it to see a man with a badge clipped to his belt. He introduced himself as a detective from the county and asked if I had known the man who'd been staying next door. I told him yes, that he was the old lady's son, and that he'd come to clean out her place after she passed. The detective wrote something down, then looked up at me and asked if I'd noticed anything unusual while he was there. My stomach dropped. I told him about the smell, the late-night lights, the truck, the bags. He nodded slowly, said they were following up on a report from the property's new owner. Apparently, when the new owners began renovating the basement, they found something buried beneath the concrete floor. Human remains. He didn't say whose, but I didn't need him to. My mind went straight to the smell, the long nights, the dragging sounds. After he left, I went down to my own basement and stood near the vent where that smell had first drifted through. The air was clean now, but I could still remember it vividly. The sharp, rotten metal stench, the way it seemed to cling to the walls. I stood there for a long time, just listening to the hum of the furnace. It's strange how something horrifying can hide so close, just on the other side of a thin wall. I think about that sometimes when I go down there. How someone could live next door, quiet and polite, while doing something unspeakable beneath their own floor. The house next door is up for sale again now. Fresh paint, new grass, bright for sale sign out front. Every time I see people touring it, I wonder if they can feel it too. That faint, invisible heaviness under the air. I don't say anything though. People move in, move out, lives continue. But sometimes when I'm down in my basement late at night, I still catch a hint of that smell in the air. just faint enough to make me wonder if it ever really went away. It started in early October of 2021, right after the first cold snap hit Rochester. The air had that damp, earthy smell that comes before winter. I remember standing by my kitchen window one night around 10, rinsing a mug, when I noticed movement in my neighbor's backyard. His porch light was off, but the weak glow from the houses nearby caught flashes of motion. Something metallic, something swinging. When I looked closer, I realized he was digging. A shovel, over and over, steady and slow. At first I didn't think much of it. People in the neighborhood did weird yard projects all the time. He was a quiet guy, probably mid-30s. Worked odd hours, kept to himself. I'd seen him mowing his lawn at midnight before, with headphones on. So digging at night didn't exactly surprise me. The next night he was at it again. Same spot. Same slow rhythm of the shovel hitting dirt. The sound carried through the cool air, that wet scrape and thud repeating like a heartbeat. When I went to take the trash out, I saw him pause and look around. He noticed me, I think, because he gave a quick nod and said something about putting in a koi pond. I didn't really respond, just waved. The words didn't fit, though. The ground there wasn't even close to level, and the spot he'd chosen was shaded all day by a tall maple. No sun for fish or plants. But I didn't question him. I just went inside, locked the door, and tried not to stare out the window again. A week passed, and the hole got bigger. Much bigger. You could see it from the street now, a wide, dark crater behind his garage. Every night I'd catch the faint scrape of a shovel, sometimes the metallic clank of a spade hitting a rock. There were piles of soil mounded up on both sides like small hills. No pond liner, no pump, no gravel or water features, just dirt. The hole was almost the size of a car by then, maybe deeper. I told myself it was none of my business, but the more I thought about it, the more uneasy I felt. It was too deliberate, too methodical. He wasn't landscaping, he was excavating. Then one night it rained hard. Cold October rain that soaked everything and turned the ground to mud. I remember the sound of it against the windows and the way the streetlights turned the puddles into glowing orange pools. I was half asleep on the couch when I heard something outside. I thought it was just the wind at first, but when I looked out through the blinds, I saw him again, out there in the downpour. The shovel was gone this time. He was hauling something heavy from the back of his garage, dragging it across the grass toward the hole. It was wrapped in a blue tarp, long and uneven. The way it sagged in the middle made my stomach tighten. He had to brace himself to lift it, shifting his weight like it was dead weight. I pulled out my phone and pretended to text in case he looked over. My hands were shaking. I remember thinking about calling someone, but what would I even say? My neighbors digging a hole and moving tarps around? It sounded insane, so I just stood there watching. He lowered the thing into the hole slowly, then disappeared into the garage again. When he came back, he carried a shovel. The next few hours, I barely moved. Every time I glanced outside, he was still there, working in the rain. Shovel up, shovel down. Dirt sliding back into the pit. By dawn, it was done. The rain had stopped, and when I finally worked up the nerve to look again, the hole was gone. Perfectly smooth ground. He'd leveled it completely. The piles of dirt were gone, the tarp too. It looked like nothing had ever been there. I remember standing there in the kitchen, staring out at that perfect patch of mud, and feeling this strange, hollow ache in my chest, like I'd watched something I shouldn't have. He didn't dig again after that. In fact, he barely came outside. His lights were off most nights, and I stopped seeing his car in the driveway as much. 3 weeks later, he moved out. No moving truck, no notice, just gone. I saw the house go dark one night and never saw him again. The blinds were left half open, and the yard froze over that winter. Snow covered everything. The ground, the spot where the hole had been, it all disappeared under ice. By March, a for sale sign went up. By April, it sold. The new owners moved in that spring. A young couple, friendly, always waving when they saw me. They started working on the yard right away, tearing up old flower beds, trimming the trees, redoing the lawn. Then in June, a police car showed up. Then another. I watched from my window as they roped off the backyard with yellow tape. The couple stood on the porch talking to an officer. Then came more vehicles, 2 unmarked SUVs, a van with equipment, men in plain clothes carrying cases and tools. They started digging in that same spot, the one that had been leveled so perfectly. At first I thought maybe they'd found an old septic tank or something left behind. But the way the officers moved, the way they sectioned the ground and took photos before each scoop of dirt, it wasn't routine. They were careful. They dug all day, then they came back the next day, and the day after. Every time I looked out the window, there were more of them. They never said anything publicly. No announcements, no interviews. Just quiet, methodical digging, like the man who'd lived there before. On the 3rd day, they filled the hole back in. The vans left that evening. The yellow tape came down the next morning. The couple stayed inside for days. I saw the wife once sitting on the porch steps staring at the yard. She looked pale, almost sick. A few weeks later, a different for sale sign went up again. The house was empty by fall. Sometimes when the wind picks up at night, I swear I can hear that same dull scrape of a shovel hitting dirt. Probably just my mind filling in the silence. But every time I look at that yard, with its perfectly smooth grass and new sod, I think about how much dirt a man has to move to hide something that big, and how long it takes before someone finally decides to dig it back up.